All right, it's 10:15 Eastern time right now. Let's get it started. And my name is Zhou. I'm an associate professor at the School of Computer Science, University of Waterloo in Canada. I'm your session chair. And this session is dimensionality reduction. And we have several amazing papers that you could listen, some amazing talks. And I just want to remind you, there's a Slido link in the end of the schedule page that you could ask questions. I'm going to also post the link on the Discord channel, and I encourage you to interact with the speakers panels. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Markus Wallinger, who is going to present UnDRground tubes exploring spatial data with multidimensional projections and set visualization. So Markus, please share your screen and take away.
Thank you for your really nice introduction. So my name is Markus Wallinger, and I'm proud to present UnDRground tubes exploring spatial data with multidimensional projections and set visualization. So suppose you're sampling soil. You're interested in the chemical elements that are contained in the sample, for example, iron, aluminum, or lead. Of course, you're sampling at the location, which gives you a coordinate, and probably you're sampling at more than one location. Now, the question is, how do you analyze this data? How do you figure out the individual contents of an element at a location? And more importantly, how do you figure out what is contained in locations that you haven't sampled? So luckily, geospatial analysts have figured out a process to analyze such data, and this is called spatial blind source separation. So spatial blind source separation takes as an input multivariate spatial data. It is blind because it has no assumptions about the input data. It performs source separation, so it decomposes the input data in simpler to explain latent components. And it is spatial because it defines a parameter, the kernel parameter, which dictates how do you consider the neighborhood of a sample location during this analysis. And what it outputs is latent components that should spatially uncorrelated show the contents of the input data set. Of course, the perfect kernel parameter is not known in advance, and you probably have to perform the analysis with different kernel parameters. And all those latent components then express really the contents of the chemical components. Now let's take a closer look at one of those components. So what the geospatial analysts work with is this view here. So on the left, you see a divergent color map of the chemical contents and the sample locations. But what they are really interested in is this loadings vector. So this loadings vector expresses the distribution in the latent component. And what it essentially is if you want to compare it, you need to perform visual cluster analysis. So you want to map it to the two-dimensional space and then figure out which latent components have a similar spatial distribution. The second factor that they are considering during the analysis process is these labels. This is closely correlated with their mental model. So they don't care about loadings that are somewhere in the middle. They care about the highest and the lowest values of loadings and assign labels accordingly. And what this gives rise to is a set visualization system. So for example, the analyst could be interested in which latent components have lower aluminum, but also high iron contents. And of course, they need to consider both perspectives. So what we then have identified is that as an input data, we have multivariate spatial data set on which SPSS analysis is performed and some statistical analysis can be derived. Then as a user, we would consider domain experts with experience in geospatial statistics and specifically in their mental model, they think in labels. And lastly, as task, we have several different tasks. So first, the cluster analysis task. So you want to show the spatial distribution in a latent component, but also find latent components with a similar distribution. On a set analysis similar, analyzing labels and finding latent components with the same labels, and a joint analysis. And the solution that we propose is called UnDRground tubes. Here you see the interface, and it can roughly be split into an overview and a detail part of the interface. But let's go over the overview first. So what we do is we represent each latent component as a glyph. This is similar to the map that the analysts are used to working with. And the labels, here we use the metro map metaphor. So we want to express each label as a line or a tree that connects all the components that have the specific label assigned. We also need to map the glyphs onto grid positions because we need later space to route the labels, and this view can essentially be used for overview tasks. So then if the analyst clicks on a specific glyph, it brings you to the detailed view. So the first part of the detailed view shows you bar charts of the loadings of a latent component. So this is really important during the analysis process to also have this view. Similarly, they are curious about the labels, and therefore we also have to show them the labels that are assigned to a component. And lastly, if they really want to dig down about the spatial distribution of chemical components in a component and the sampling locations, then we provide them with a map view. So the detailed view is fairly standard visualization design out of the toolbox that we have available. But what we introduced is exactly this overview view. So this is what we call the UnDRground tubes pipeline. To really briefly mention it, what we want to achieve is we want to project the latent components to the two-dimensional space and then connect the components with the same labels by either a line or a tree. And this is a fairly flexible visualization idiom. So anything that we can express in similarities in a high-dimensional space could be input to the UnDRground tubes pipeline. And it's also interesting, we can focus on different aspects of the data with a weighting input parameter. But if you want to know more, please see the paper or ask me later. Now, for evaluation, we had essentially 3 pillars that we relied upon. So the first pillar is the evaluation with geospatial analysts. So those are the domain experts. Then we also did the evaluation with visualization design experts. And lastly, we had also computational experiments where we evaluated the views, also the application with typical quality criteria. But for this talk, I would mainly like to focus on the SPSS experts. So the experts had, so our 2 experts had years experience in geospatial analysis. They were used to SPSS. They had their own workflows on how to analyze data sets. And what we did is we gave them a real-world data set and asked them to perform the same analysis process, but now with the help of UnDRground tubes. It required them some training, 15 to 30 minutes to get used to the application. But once this was done, both experts reported that they found new interesting aspects of the data that they couldn't find with their usual processes. And they also could identify useful features that really helped them to solve some of the analysis tasks. But you can read the statements in the paper. I just want to give you one example that we had during the analysis process. So here you see an example view that the analyst generated. And he picked 2 labels. So he wanted to know how is the Moron's eye and the kurtosis. And he showed the label for when both are high. So they are expressed by the red and blue line. What the assumption of the analyst is that if both are high, then they appear together in latent components. But if we zoom in to parts of our overview visualization, you can actually see that this is not the case. Only a few components have both Moron's eye and kurtosis high at the same time. And this really triggered the urge of the analyst to dig deeper into why this is the case, because it completely broke with the assumption he had. Okay, to summarize and conclude my talk, we presented UnDRground tubes, which is an application that can help in analyzing multivariate spatial data. UnDRground tube, so the pipeline itself to generate the overview, is a flexible visualization idiom that could potentially be applied to other domains. And we think that our evaluation shows that we can effectively support the user tasks that we have identified. But in terms of future work, there are also some to-dos left. So our SPSS experts suggested additional use cases that would require additional views in our interface. Of course, applying it to a different domain. One example would be we could map patients to the two-dimensional space by their vitals, and then use maybe the symptoms of illnesses as the set labels. And lastly, visualizing sets in other contexts. For us, it was the spatial context, is still considered an open problem in the research community. And with that, I would like to finish, and I'm happy to take any question now or later on Discord. Thank you.
Great. I'm physically calling and other people are virtually copying. Very nice job, Markus. While the questions are kicking in on Slido, I have a question. So I really like the metaphor of this UnDRground tubes, and it shows the spatial locations and connect the relevant elements. However, I found the visual elements, each the small multiple, too small. I know that you have zoom in, zoom out capability. I wonder what does the user say when they interacting with your system?
So yes, this was noted less from actually the domain experts, but more when we did the evaluation with visualization designers. So they noted that two things. So first of all, the colors that we use in the application, the red and blue specifically, clash with the small multiples, the glyphs. That is something that we would change further. And they also said that, of course, the scalability of the overview is not necessarily that great when you really want to see the details. But as with the experts, they were more used to those small glyphs and the color maps, and they didn't report it as a specific issue they had during the analysis process. But also it may be a case that the data set we gave them at 120 latent components, that this was not large enough to really highlight this issue. But I agree with your observation.
Okay. We do have a question on Slido. I just repeated the word. It's from anonymous audience. Sorry, I might have missed it, but what is the purpose for the subway lines and how to interpret it? Are they meant to guide users to find similar projections?
Yes. So the idea of the subway lines is we have to show somehow the set visualization aspect. So each of the latent components has those labels assigned. And those labels need to be shown explicitly in the overview. So we have to use some visual element to represent that latent component belongs to a set. In our case, we relied on the MetroMap metaphor. Of course, other visual metaphors, for example, overlay-based set visualization could fulfill the same job. And it would probably be interesting to see an alternative and compare against.
Hey, yeah. Let's thank Markus again. And let's move on to the second speaker. The second paper is interpreting high-dimensional projection with capacity. And Zhang is going to present on behalf of Zhang. Please take away.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for your kindly introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zhang from Fudan University, supervised by Professor Chen, And because all other authors are unable to give presentations due to graduation or something others, I'm very honored to be here to present work on behalf of my amazing colleagues. And first give the background information. So high dimensional projection, also known as the dimensionality reduction algorithm, is a crucial and effective method for analyzing high dimensional data. But while it's easier for people to analyze high dimensional data by reducing dimensions, since people are used to 3-dimensional space or 2-dimensional space, there are still some problems with it. First, due to the black box nature of these projections, it's difficult for users to understand how these results are obtained and identify where and to what extent some errors or some distortion occurs during the projections. And it's also challenging to explore the connections between the original resource and the projection resource, original data and projection resource. So the projection resource and the projection data needs to be more interpretable. And so our main goal is to help users comprehend high-dimensional data and enhance the interpretability of these projected resources. And we focus on the fidelity of the data distribution after projection. And we identify 4 analyzing tasks in our system and in our work. The first is that we need to enhance understanding of high-dimensional data distribution, and then we need to analyze the differences between the projection resource and the high-dimensional data distributions. And thirdly, we need to explore the causes of the projection errors or something about distortion. And fourth, we need to optimize the projection resource with large projection errors. So we will use a capacity-based, which is metric-based methods in visual analytics methodology to solve these tasks. So let's talk about the core definition of our paper, that is capacity. So the concept of capacity has been utilized in proposing a new dimensional reduction algorithm in a long time. And the key of capacity lies in calculating the ratio of the data points within a specific neighborhood to the total number of data. And here is a simple illustration of how to explore the distribution differences of one data point. Like shown in the right figure that the total data number is 10, and in high dimensional space, there are 3 points, including the point S itself are in the point SR neighborhood. And the capacity is 3/10, that is equal to the 0.3. And after the projection, there are 7 points in its neighborhood. So this is a huge distribution gap between and after projection, as you can see by this in this figure. And by the way, the capacity of point S is 0.7 now, changed a lot. So we can use the capacity to evaluate the data distribution changes happened in the projection. So here is a semantic diagram and workflow diagram of our method. Actually, we first analyze the data distribution by measuring the relationships between the original data and the projection results. And then combined with the VA system, users can select a data point and analyze the data distribution and its changes before and after projections. And we also define some distortion sets and a distortion metric based on the capacity to help visualize distortions and quantify the distortion extent. And based on the above discussion and the methods and definitions, we have developed a visual analytics system, which is called HILO. So the visual design of the interface aims to enhance the understanding of data distribution and the distortions, comparing both the original data with the projected data, and further improve the interpretability of the resource. And it contains 3 categories of views. The first category of views focuses on intuitively visualizing the information of high-dimensional and low-dimensional data distributions. And the second category of views focuses on comparative analysis of the changes in the high-dimensional and the low-dimensional distributions and visualizing the information related to the projection errors. And the third category of views is related to our specifically designed interaction recommendation algorithm. And I will introduce this soon. So why we need an interaction recommendation? Because when users explore our VA system, they know what and how distortions are in the projection process. But to further improve the interpretation of the resource, users should be allowed to modify the projection resource and explore the newly obtained resource. So actually, the primary purpose of enabling user interaction in modifying resource is to incorporate their real-time knowledge into the system. But however, due to the black box nature and the complexity of the algorithms, user may require assistance or hints to modify local resource. So we develop an interaction algorithm based on capacity and the BFGS, which is a second-order optimization quasi-Newton algorithm. And actually, we will recommend a new coordinate position for the user-selected data point to the users, aiming to minimize the distortions based on the current data distribution. And after exploring the system, the user may trust the resource and accept the provided recommendations, thereby enhancing their understanding of high-dimensional data, distortion, and the different methods. And this is a demo video about the case study.
We enter the ID in the input box to select the data. First, we want to know why the capacity distortion value is so large. In the global capacity analysis view, the data show clustering relationship denoted as cluster 1 and cluster 2. According to the colors, the purple data points belong to cluster 1 while these three sets belong to cluster 2. By their definitions, the data in cluster 1 are closer to the selected data in high-dimensional space, but too far away in the DR results. Most data in cluster 2 are further away from the selected data in high-dimensional space, but too close in low-dimensional space. These reasons lead to a significant distortion value of the selected data. Secondly, we want to know the specific difference in the data distribution of the selected data's neighborhood after projection. Let's analyze the set NRLH as an example. The data in this set with the same label as the selected data account for the majority of this set. When hovering the mouse over the rectangle in the capacity analysis view, the corresponding data distribution is displayed in the projection result, and the corresponding rectangles in the comparative view are highlighted. The upper axis represents the high dimension, the lower axis represents the low dimension, and the connections represent the change in the distance of the data from the selected data after projection. By interacting with the comparative view, we find that the rectangles can be divided into two clusters, cluster 2A and cluster 2B, and these two clusters correspond to the clusters of data in the DR results. By interactions, we can see how much the absolute and relative distances of the data in these two clusters from the selected data have changed after projection. In the same way, we can get the low-dimensional distribution and the corresponding distance variation of the data in other distortion sets. Next, we enter the ID in the
Okay, and then this is a video about how the user may interact with the assistance of the interaction recommendation algorithm.
Finally, we explore the impact of changing the DR result. We drag the data point to around the recommendation result. After the interface is updated, the capacity distortion decreases significantly from about 3 to 0.219. This confirms that the selected data has a large distortion after projection. Finally,
Okay, so besides the case study that we have done with some domain experts, we also provide some resource about the user study and algorithm experiments. So in the left figure, you can see that the users tend to give higher subjective ratings about the subjective questions and achieve high accuracy in some objective questions. And in the algorithm experiments, we can see that a large number of data sets, the proportions of the distortion was largely decreased by the user interaction. So our system and algorithm enhance users' understanding. And please refer to our paper for the detail about the evaluation. So to conclude that our work is based on capacity-based definition and the recommendation algorithm, and they are agnostic to the different dimensional reduction algorithms. And in the future, we are trying to propose a general framework and visual views for handling multiple types of the high-dimensional data projection reduction tasks, and try to explore the relationship between capacity-based definition and the cluster locations. And we also need to investigate more efficient and multi-point based recommendation algorithms. And we also need to explore the potential for theoretical extension of capacity-based approach. So thank you for listening, and for more information, please refer to the paper, and I'm very happy to take any questions.
Okay, let's thank Kai. And there are a couple questions on Slido. The first question is from Peter. So does the computational complexity of the recommendation algorithm support real-time interaction?
Okay, so from my understanding that our current algorithm is based on the BFGS, and it can calculate the resource in maybe about 5 seconds. So our system can support real-time interactions. And you can see the detail about the computational complexity introduction in our paper. Yes.
Okay, there's another question from anonymous audience. What problem have you solved that other work cannot solve? I guess that's a difficult question.
Wow. Oh, a very good question. And although I'm not an author for this paper, but from my understanding that their measurement method focuses on analyzing the data distribution, and the distribution of both the original data and the projected data is the essential feature of other features. So maybe that if we can analyze the distribution change clearly, then we can better analyze the high-dimensional data projection. And at the same time, in the maybe the supplementary materials that I remember for this paper, they also verified one point, that is through capacity analysis of the distribution, they can get some results similar to those used by some metrics defined by other works. And at the same time, they also prove that the measurement, the capacity they propose is almost continuously everywhere when analyzing distribution changes, so which may ensure the reliability of the measurement itself. You can also refer to the paper for something other and details. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks Kai for the awesome talk. And let's move on to the third paper. Is called DimBridge, interactive examination of visual patterns in dimensionality reduction with predictive logic, which will be presented by Brian Montambault. Forgive my pronunciation, your name. Brian, share your screen and take away.
All right, awesome, thank you. So hi everyone. My name is Brian Montambault. I'm a PhD student in the Visual Analytics Lab at Tufts, and I'm excited to present our work on DimBridge, a visual analytics system for explaining patterns in dimensionality reduction with predicate logic. So dimensionality reduction is a powerful tool for exploring high-dimensional data. Imagine you're a scientist and you want to explore a data set consisting of cells, each defined by thousands of gene expressions. You can use a DR algorithm like UMAP to visualize your data, while preserving relevant structures like clusters, outliers, and any number of other interesting shapes. But you're left wondering, what do these patterns actually tell us about relationships between genes? For example, how do we explain this cluster in terms of the original dimensions? We could try mapping one of the original dimensions to our DR visualization, and we notice that our cluster is characterized by the CST3 gene within a higher range compared to the rest of the cells. But if we try this for all dimensions, we might find that most are not relevant to our cluster. What we need is a concise explanation in terms of dimensions that are relevant to a specific pattern. To solve this, we present DimBridge, a visual analytics system that allows users to select a pattern in the projection view and generate a succinct explanation in the original dimensions in the predicate view. Now we're looking at an example where each data point is an animal image defined by characteristics like excited, whiskers, and big animal. Explanations are in the form of predicates, defined by a set of relevant dimensions and value ranges. DimBridge finds predicates from user interactions with a novel algorithm called predicate regression. Predicates are represented as a parameterized bounding box in high-dimensional space, and we use gradient descent to find the one that best matches the pattern selected by the user. So in this case, The selected cluster is explained by specific ranges of the excited, whiskers, and big animal dimensions, and all other dimensions were determined to be irrelevant for explaining that cluster, so they are ignored. In addition to displaying the relevant dimensions and the ranges, we show data points sampled from this bounding box. So here, that cluster that we've explained is explaining cats. And all the relevant dimensions are shown in the Splon view, allowing users to visualize the patterns in a reduced subspace of the original dimensions. So DimBridge is able to explain a number of patterns in DR results beyond just clusters, and I'll show this now with a quick demo. So we've developed DimBridge as a Python module that allows us to run DimBridge at a notebook environment. We can load DimBridge along with pandas and whatever other modules we need for our analysis. We'll load in our animals data set with pandas. We can generate a dimensionality reduction. We could use UMAP. We could use any other DR algorithm. For this case, we're just going to load in those results from a previous notebook. And then we load the original data frame, the image URLs optionally, and the dimensionality reduction. And we get DimBridge in our notebook environment. So I'm going to start by showing off by showing the first interaction, which allows us to select and explain a cluster. So we can draw over cluster using the select tool, and DimBridge will generate explanations that distinguish this cluster from the rest of the data. So if you look at the results of one of these clusters, DimBridge generates an explanation, which is a predicate consisting of two features. The dimensions that are important for distinguishing this cluster from the rest are the whiskers and the big animal dimension. If we look at our samples, we see that that corresponds to cats. Points in the projection view and the Splon view that are purple were in the selection and are also in the predicate. We see a few points colored in red, so those were not in the selected cluster, but do fall in that bounding box in the original dimensions. And then we have a few points which are colored blue, which were those that were in the selection, but were outside of the bounding box. So we can use this to determine how well our bounding box actually matches the selection made by the user. So we can explain individual clusters. The second interaction I'm going to show, we can select a cluster and then contrast it with another cluster. And now DimBridge will generate explanations, will generate predicates that explain the difference between the two clusters. So now each explanation consists of two predicates, one for each cluster, and highlighting dimensions that distinguish the cluster from each other. So in this case, we see our first cluster was lions, our second cluster is cats, and the dimensions that distinguish the two, we have lions on the lower scale of big eyes versus cats on the higher scale. Cats more whiskers, and lions higher on the big animal dimension. So we have one more interaction to show that. I'm going to change the brush mode to curve. So we can look at individual clusters. We can look at trying to compare two different clusters. Our final interaction is we can again select any point in the dimensionality reduction, and now we can draw any continuous shape, and DimBridge will generate an explanation that explains how those samples change as we travel through this shape. So this can be anything. This can be the curve following the path of a specific cluster. In this case, we have this path kind of connecting these two clusters, so we can try to explain that. Or a cluster with a particularly interesting shape, we can just follow the shape of that and see what that tells us. So now the explanations generated by DimBridge are going to be a set of clusters explaining how this point changes along specific dimensions. For this particular case, we started with at the starting point of our shape, starting with tigers, going to leopards and cheetahs, and then back to lions. We can see how, for example, in the big animal dimension, we start with larger animals with tigers. It gets lower as we kind of go through this cluster. and we're hitting more of the smaller animals. And then finally, at the end of this cluster, we're back to lions, back with higher values of the big animal dimension. For the spotted dimension, we see another pattern where starting with less spotted for the tigers, getting more spotted as we go through the leopards and the cheetahs, and then less spotted as we go down through the lions. And we can see the same thing if we look at that subspace in the swan view. So looking at big animals and pointy ears, we can see we start with big animals as we go through our shape in the DR. In the subspace, we see that means we're starting at big animals, getting smaller, and then looping back to big animals as we go back to lions. So to summarize, DimBridge allows us to identify patterns in the DR results using 3 interactions. We can select to explain a cluster. We can select and contrast to explain the difference between 2 clusters. And then we can select and draw to explain any shape that might appear in our results. We then visualize the relevant subspace of the original dimensions using a novel algorithm called predicate regression. We evaluated DimBridge with the help of 2 collaborators in the material science domain, whose goal was to understand alloys represented by around 500 dimensions. They praised the flexibility of DimBridge and in the interactions, being able to identify patterns, as well as the quick responsiveness in being able to quickly explain those patterns. So we found that these 2 features facilitated a workflow that was highly iterative. We saw our collaborators rapidly generating and testing hypotheses using DimBridge. So for future work, we want to focus on evaluating DimBridge on a wider range of use cases. To facilitate this, we've developed the Python package that I showed in the demo. So anyone can run DimBridge, load in their own data using pandas. So please take a look at that on GitHub if you're interested. Here's my email if you'd like to collaborate with us, or there are any questions that we don't get to today. And thank you all for listening, and I'm excited to hear your questions.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And we have a couple questions on Slido, but we can only ask 1 question because of time limit. So I would say there's a question from Eric Zhou. How scalable is this interaction method-based data set that has a large number of features?
Right, yeah. So there's a trade-off between scalability and the accuracy of the predicates that are generated. And that's going to be more of a consideration as you get more dimensions. In the demo I showed, it was a fairly small number of dimensions. We could see that it was pretty responsive. So the option would be with higher dimensions, we can decrease the learning stage of the predicate regression algorithm. So we might be getting less accurate predicates, but improving interactivity. So that's really the core of the trade-off. And the number of dimensions we're dealing with is gonna be what determines that. Okay.
Yeah. So because of the time limit, we cannot allow for asking every question. I highly recommend the audience ask their questions on the Discord channel and to keep discussing on the Discord channel. And let's thank Brian again and move on to the next paper. The title is 2D embeddings of multidimensional partitionings, which is going to be presented by Marina Ayers.
Yeah,
Marina,
great.
please take it away.
Yeah. Thank you for the kind introduction. As mentioned before, I will today present our work on 2D embeddings of multidimensional partitionings. So what am I talking about when I'm talking about multidimensional partitionings or segmentations? So basically, by partitionings or segmentations, we mean the same thing. Partitionings or segmentations are a little bit differently used on different domains, but in this talk, I will use them exchangeably. So let's start by looking at the segmentation as it is commonly used, for example, in the context of medical imaging. In this kind of data, each position or each spatial sample basically belongs to exactly one segment. Here we see an example of a 2D, of a 3D embedding, of a 3D segmentation where we see the segment corresponding to a liver. Now, if we go on, we can add other segments such as vessels, a needle, bones, or the liver. And as you can see already here, that even though we are only in 3D, we have significant occlusion. But if we increase our dimensionality even further and want to visualize a multidimensional segmentation, this problem gets even larger. Here we look at a 4D segmentation, which is representing a parameter space where each segment represents one region in parameter space where the corresponding parameter space samples lead to a similar behavior. And in this visualization, we basically right now see slices through this parameter space, but it does not allow us to get a global overview about the segmentation. So motivated by looking into parameter space partitionings or segmentations, we can ask different questions. So we might ask, what are the sizes of the segments? And here we want to know which sizes are largest, which ones are smaller, to also deduce which segments basically have a higher influence and are more probable in the parameter space. What we also might ask are which segments share boundary, so that we can know between which possible outcomes from the different parameter settings a transition is possible. And we might ask how large is this boundary to also say how likely is it that a transition basically can occur. So based on these questions, we define a set of requirements for our visualization. And here at first, we want to preserve the topology. And this is something we want to guarantee, because if the topology, so basically the neighborhood relations, are violated, it might lead to severe misinterpretations. Then we also want to preserve the relative segment sizes as well as the relative boundary sizes. But as we are reducing the dimensionality, we cannot preserve them exactly, and therefore we optimize for this criteria, even though in most cases they cannot be exactly preserved. So before I explain our algorithm in detail, let's have a look at an example. Here we see again the 4D parameter space we've seen before, but we also see a 2D embedding of the parameter space as we propose in our paper. And in this visualization, we can see, for example, additional segments as this yellow one that weren't present in the selected slices we can see on the left. But what we can also see is which segments are connected. So for example, here we can see that the yellow segment and the green segment don't share a joint boundary in our visualization. This means they also don't share a joint boundary in the high dimensional space. And what we also can see is that the green segment takes up a significantly larger amount of space than the yellow segment does, which can be interpreted as having a larger portion of the parameter space covered by the green segment than by the yellow one. So let's look into how we get here. At first, we model our segmentation as a graph. Here we look at an artificial example, which I will use for demonstration purposes, and each segment corresponds to a vertex in our graph, and each joint boundary in the high dimensional space corresponds to an edge. Then we can model our segment sizes and assign them to the vertex sizes or vertex weights, and we can model our boundary sizes and assign them to the edge weights. Now, you might wonder, why don't we just show this graph as a node link diagram? So there are different reasons. One of them is that we want to show the segmentation as a segmentation, basically, so the user does not have to abstract from this image of a segmentation. Additionally, several features, for example, segments embedded by other segments in our visualization, can be shown directly, as it is in the high dimensional space, as a segment that is embedded in another segment. And additionally, as we have a dense pixel visualization, we can make better use of space. For example, here we have several segments that are pretty small. And of course, they're also small in our visualization, but at least not as small as in the node link diagram. So how do we get from the graph to our visual encoding? And here we make use of the fact that the graph already encodes the topology, and therefore we use it as an initial condition. We create a graph embedding, and then use this graph embedding as the initial state for a cellular automaton, which we then use for spatial optimization. And here, as our graph is in high dimensional space and we embed it in 2D, it's not necessarily planar. So we might end up with edge crossings, which we assign to a special state in our cellular automaton. And then for the optimization, we basically change the states of our automaton based on specific criteria, which are influenced by the neighboring cells' states. And here we define our criteria in a way such that we optimize the area sizes as well as the boundary sizes. And also in each iteration step, we make sure that we preserve the topology. So let's look at this optimization. Here we first see that the different segments spread to get rid of the background. And we also see optimizations. For example, here we see that the red segment, which is pretty small and embedded in the blue one, shrinked again. So based on this optimization, after a set of iterations, we might end up with a state like this. And here we see we still have the edge crossings, which are represented here as the special state in a black color. And what we also have are this leftover background cells, basically, which are here shown in white. These are not completely avoidable because, for example, in this example, the gray segment and the green segment do not share a joint boundary, and also the purple segment and the pink segment do not share a joint boundary in high dimensional space. So it's not possible that this cell changes its state without violating the topology. That's why we just keep this background cell and basically refer to it in the following as a segment separator because it separates the different segments. Now, based on our final result for the cellular automaton, we create a visualization. And here our rendering is inspired by Gaussian tree maps, but to reduce the visual clutter, we want to keep the interior of our segments flat. We also remove the special states which represented the edge crossings and basically replace them by a crossing. And we keep our segment separators, and we also make sure that we keep it in a distinct color. So for example, in this example, we use different colors for the segments, but kept the segment separators in white. This shading or this visualization allows us to be very flexible and basically independent of the color coding, which would allow to choose different options and also encode additional information about the segments in the colors. This is better visible here, where we, for demonstration purposes, just show all segments in the same color. So here we still have our segment separators, and to separate them from the actual segments, we again shows different colors. So here they stay white. And we also still have our crossings, which we can see, but we did not want to make them stick out. So they are basically created in the same way as all other boundaries here. We ran a set of different algorithmic evaluations, but for the sake of time, I won't go into detail, but refer you to our paper or ask later on. Instead, I want to show you an application example. So here we see again our four-dimensional parameter space we've already seen a few times. And actually, this parameter space corresponds to a simulation ensemble for semiconductor quantum wires, where each sample basically corresponds to a simulation result, as you see here in the left. And in this case, I want to talk a little bit about this purple cluster, because here we see these two peaks which have a small connection. If we now look into this embedding with our algorithm, we can see that we also, of course, have the purple segment in there. But in contrast to what we might deduce from the selected slices, we do not only have a single purple segment, but instead we see that the segment is split, and indeed we have two different ones. Therefore, as we can only see here that it's split, but we cannot see any details, and we also have quite a bit of distortion due to the dimensionality reduction, we propose to use our visualization together with more detailed visualization, for example, the hyperslices, which allow for a detailed investigation and also get back to the ranges. But this structural information and the overview can be easily obtained in our embedding. And with that, I want to conclude my talk. I presented an embedding of multidimensional segmentations or partitionings to a 2D. And of course, there's still a few limitations. Currently, the computation times are quite long. So we plan to improve on computation times and also reduce the line-like segments that sometimes due to the algorithms optimization occur. And also, while I briefly mentioned that it can be used for example, for navigation in higher dimensional spaces, we want to explore more applications in the interactive visual analysis process. The code of our algorithm is freely available on GitHub, so feel free to try it out. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Marina. And we have a question on Slido. I just repeat it here. It seems that the algorithm creates artifacts, such as narrow corridors. Could there be more optimization to make the shapes more round, for example?
Yes, definitely. We briefly looked into that, and I also mentioned it in future work. We are very well aware of that. One problem or one disadvantage of this purely local optimization is that you might end up with these artifacts, which are, for example, caused by edge crossings, which can move under certain circumstances, but not always, or connectivity issues. But we have a few ideas. For example, one could add an additional criterion to favor roundish shapes in the optimization. But I think the most important point to address this issue is to provide more flexibility in these points that kind of fix the layout, such as the topological connections, and also more flexibility in the motion of the edge crossings. But there are so many special cases already, even though most of it is automated, and I think it's definitely possible. It needs some further thought.
Okay, thank you. Due to time, we have to move on, and I highly recommend audience to interact with the speaker on the Discord channel. And our next paper is Accelerating Hyperbolic T-SNE, which will be presented by Martin Skorsky. Yeah, please take it away.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Welcome to my presentation, which I'm giving on behalf also of my co-authors, from which I really want to mention Hunter von Geffe, my shared first co-author, who was a master student with us in our group and on whose master thesis this work has been built. In this talk, I will tell you how to accelerate computations of your hyperbolic TSNE embeddings. That's a mouthful of words, and basically I want to take you through this title, but backwards. So we're going to start with TSNE, look into hyperbolic TSNE, and then finally to see how can you accelerate this. So without any further ado, TSNE is our favorite dimensionality reduction method. So if you have some high dimensional data, like the MNIST dataset, where each of these images is a high dimensional data point, you can use TSNE to map it into a low dimensional embedding, just like this one. TSNE does so by applying two forces on each of the points in this low dimensional embedding. That's attractive and repulsive forces. The attractive forces are based on the high dimensional data. So points that are close to each other in high dimensional space should also end up close to each other in the low dimensional space. The repulsive forces are only based on the embedding space, where every single point in the embedding space tries to get a bit of wiggle room. That makes them costly to compute, as every single point in the embedding has to take into account every other point of the embedding. So in a naive implementation of the TSNE algorithm, you would get an n-squared complexity of the repulsive forces. Therefore, prior work has introduced acceleration structures like the Barnes-Hutt acceleration, which works via a quad tree data structure. And this data structure approximates the repulsive forces, which brings the complexity down to n log n, thereby drastically speeding up the process. That's a quick refresher on TSNE and the accelerations that have been done there. Let's move on to hyperbolic TSNE, and we'll keep the original TSNE pipeline up here as a reminder. The data set itself doesn't really change. We also want to still embed this data, but instead of embedding it into classical Euclidean space, we now move it into hyperbolic space. Hyperbolic space in this Poincaré depiction reminds a bit of the Dutch artist M.C. Escher. And there's a couple of things I just want to highlight here. Note that this circular depiction of hyperbolic space is actually a complete infinite space. The boundary of this circle is infinity, and you can actually see that to a certain extent. If you go from the center of the circle towards the outside, you'll notice that the triangles keep shrinking and shrinking till they reach, well, infinity at the boundary. That's a mathematical space. You can study it, you can learn a lot about this, but why would I want to use this in a visualization? Well, previous work has shown that because this space grows exponentially from the center towards the outside, it's actually really great to visualize hierarchies. Here's an example from the Poincaré Maps paper of Klimakovskaya et al., who embedded a data set that has a strong hierarchy along the temporal axis in the data. And indeed, here up you can see the temporal axis, and indeed you'll see that this hierarchy moves from the center of the hyperbolic space outside, where older ages or older age cells are found rather on the boundary or close to the boundary of this embedding space than the younger ones. So it's a good space to use if you have specific data sets that lend itself well to this. However, computing this embedding is extremely costly. That's mainly because there has not been any movement in the direction of an acceleration structure as we had seen in Euclidean space. So for now, we can say, all right, we keep our data and we can create these embeddings in hyperbolic space. So the last thing to see is how can we create those embeddings fast? So how to accelerate hyperbolic TSNE? Well, we start by borrowing a concept, namely the concept of polar quad trees. Remember that we're now talking about points in this circular or disk-like representation. And polar quad trees are built in the following way. You start from the entire approximation or representation, and then you split it at first into these 4 quads. And you continue for each cell that has more than 1 point, like this one on top, you continue splitting it further by splitting it along a angular direction and a radial direction. And you would continue this further and further and further, and you would end up for several points in a disk-like representation with something like this. And it does succeed in giving each of the points a cell to live in. It does respect certain properties of hyperbolic space that I'm not going to get into here, but you can already see that it looks a bit squished towards the boundary of the hyperbolic space. All these cells get extremely tiny and become basically slivers towards the outside of the disk. So we sat down and we modified the building process a little bit to obtain way more compact, but more representative also cells in this tree representation, where again, we have 1 cell representing each of these points. The details will be in the paper. Let me show you how we actually use this now to accelerate the embedding process. So on the right-hand side here, I have n iterations. So we have all these points in the disk shape representation. And on the right-hand side here, you see a query point. That's a point for which we want to know what are the points it should be repulsing or it should be repulsed by. I highlight in this representation all these cells of the tree, which we take into account when computing the repulsive forces. And you'll see that we take into account a lot of detail close to the point, where on the other side of this representation, basically we summarize the contribution of all these points by just the center point of this tree cell. Thereby, we get away from this n-squared complexity, and we can move to n log n, just like in the Euclidean case. So we can use our data structure to speed it up. Now, for a couple of results, I can already hear some questions coming from the audience. How fast is this now? How much do we gain? Well, for this data set here, that's a data set on the C. elegans data, the original embedding was computed by Klimakovskaya et al. In their Poincaré maps paper, and it took them 2 to 3 hours on the GPU, and they didn't even embed the full data set. They embedded a 40,000 point sample. However, with our acceleration, it's possible to do it within 45 minutes on the CPU with the full data set, so more than twice the points. Now you're asking, how good is this? You told us in the beginning it's an approximation. Well, we checked it very thoroughly, both qualitatively by comparing, but also on various quantitative metrics, such as the gradient and the cost function, the one nearest neighbor error that was introduced by van der Marten, but also precision recall diagrams. You'll find all of that in the paper. Finally, how can you find details? Well, I'll refer you to the paper, Accelerating Hyperbolic TSNE. How can you play with this yourself? We have a repository for you to download and try. And finally, how can you ask all your questions right now, or you can contact me via these means. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Martin. You answer all the questions I plan to ask.
I'm sorry, you need to think of a new one, no?
pretty good talk. So I just have a quick question.
Sure.
Does it have to be run on GPU, or can I do on CPU? If I do on CPU, is it reasonable or practical to use your algorithm?
Yeah, so actually now with these acceleration data structures, it becomes feasible to run this on the CPU. Beforehand, you would really rather want to move it to the GPU, but now our implementation is actually a fully CPU-based implementation, so no strings attached. You can just run this on any machine that you have.
Okay, there's one question on side though.
Sure.
We may want to answer this briefly because we are short on time. So this acceleration hyperbolic space can be extended into other type of complex DR method? Question mark. So can it be extended to other type of DR methods?
Very good question. I assume so. So basically everything that you can apply similar types of acceleration like the Barnes-Hutt acceleration to, you could just take this for their respective hyperbolic representations. But if you have a specific method in mind, I'm happy to chat on Discord about it.
Okay, great. Let's thank Martin again, and let's move on to the last paper of this session, which is titled with TopoMap++, a faster and more space-efficient technique to compute projections with topological guarantees, which will be presented by Philip. Yeah, Philip, please take away.
Sorry, now you can hear me. Thank you for the introduction. So I present our work titled TopoMap++, a faster and more space-efficient technique to compute projections with topological guarantees. So topology-based methods analyze the structure of the data, highlighting important global relationships. These methods find application in diverse areas, such as brain analysis, tumor segmentation, urban analysis, and environmental science. These applications often involve high-dimensional data, which needs to be transformed in order to be visualized. Common methods like TSNE and UMAP focus on preserving geometric properties, such as local neighborhoods and distance between points. However, these methods do not guarantee the preservation of global structure or the overall shape of the data, leading to potential misinterpretations. Here we have 5 different TSNE projections from the same dataset. Each one can lead inexperienced users to different conclusions. To tackle this problem, research has been done to incorporate topological features in the projection. Here we have a 3D dataset, and here, 3 different geometry-preserving projections. Notice that each of them tries to preserve the cycle somehow, but to achieve this goal, they can separate or artificially create clusters. Here we have a topology-preserving projection called TopoMap that has provable guarantees of mapping points in 2D, preserving the connected components. Our work focuses on extends the TopoMap works and address its main drawbacks. First, TopoMap has 2 main problems. It produces a star shape with very long branches, which can create a very sparse layout. This can make it difficult to analyze the data when you have several points. And second, the computational process can be too expensive. So, we propose 3 contributions. The first is a layout improvement scheme to highlight important structures in the TopoMap layout. Second, a topology-guided tree-map-based exploratory mechanism that facilitates the analysis of high-dimensional data. And third, an approximation scheme that speeds up the TopoMap computational process. So let's take a look at our first contribution. Let's introduce how TopoMap works to introduce the main difference in our algorithm. We start with a set of points in high dimension. Then we compute the Euclidean minimum spanning tree. Our goal is to place points in 2D respecting these distances. We start with a component for each point. And we join components following the increasing distance in the Euclidean minimum spanning tree. First, we merge components that are connected by edges of distance 1 in the minimum spanning tree. Then, we do that with edges of size 2, until the last edge, which is, in this case, 9. Note that using this procedure, groups that are close in the original space, like D, E, and F, are mapped to dense components in the projection, what can be hard to identify since they take little visual space. This would be the final TopoMap projection. Imagine that we want to analyze the points D, E, and F. How can we modify the algorithm so it stands out this group instead of hiding it? You can use the same algorithm, but instead of respecting the distance in the minimum spanning tree, you can multiply this distance by a constant inside this component. So these components occupy a larger visual space, going from this to this. In this way, we still preserve the topology locally, that is, inside each component. And we only could use this idea because D, E, and F form a component during the original procedure. So an important question is how we identify components of interest to analyze. And this takes us to our second contribution. Because the previous procedure creates a filtration that can be captured by a hierarchical tree. So our goal is to find important nodes in this tree so we can focus on them. For that, we adapted the notion of a topological simplification. The user can set a threshold parameter that will be used to simplify this tree, merging low persistent components. For a given threshold, we continue keep merging leaf nodes that have less than this threshold number of points. For example, if we set the threshold equal to, all red leaves are below the threshold and have a sibling leaf, so we merge them with their siblings. We continue this procedure until there are no more leaves to merge. At this point, we stop merging components. Now, each leaf node with size greater than threshold corresponds to a component of interest. In this case, we have these 3 components of interest. If we set the threshold to 3, we also don't have more leaves to merge, but ij would not be a component of interest anymore. The same trees can be represented by a tree map, where we only represent nodes of the simplified tree that are above the given threshold. You can use this tree map not only to identify the components of interest, but to allow the user to iteratively choose components to increase in the visualization. So let's see how these two mechanisms work together. Here we have the original top map projection of the MNIST dataset. We set 1% of the total dataset size as a threshold parameter and highlight each component of interest found using the previous procedure with a different color. And here we have our proposed top map ++ layout. We can notice three things. First, the components of interest takes more visual space in the projection. Second, by preserving the topology, we automatically found groups that are meaningful, since each one of them only contains one type of number. And third, these groups are almost all type of diversity in the dataset. The main bottleneck of the topomap algorithm is to compute the Euclidean minimum spanning tree. Because in the worst case, we have to compute all possible distance between points. So instead of computing all this distance, we propose to compute an intermediate sparsity graph that tries to capture this neighborhood relationship, and then compute the minimum spanning tree of this graph instead. This graph is the Vamana graph, introduced in the DASC ANN paper, to be used as a near neighbor search index. This graph can be computed very efficiently. So to assess the quality of this approximation, we compare the Euclidean minimum spanning tree with our approximated minimum spanning tree in 4 different datasets. So the first is the MNIST dataset. The second is the big ANN dataset that is composed by 1 million SIFT descriptors of images. And the third is a dataset of LLMs embeddings produced by the Llama model, and also the stitch-aware dataset, where we extracted the embeddings of each image using a vision model. So using this procedure, we achieve results that were really faster, with more than 300 speedup in the MNIST dataset and 600 speedup on the stitch-aware. Also, we noticed that it produced a high-quality approximation, since the bottleneck distance that measured topological similarity between the approximated minimum spanning tree and the original one is relatively small. So to show how this exploratory mechanism works, we briefly show how we can explore a dataset using these tools. So the dataset that you analyze is composed by the embedding of the option chosen by an LLM when answering multiple choice questions. Here you can see the original topomap projection, which is hard to interpret since it is too sparse. Here we set the threshold to 1% of the total number of points, that in this case is 50. And we can see that it automatically finds 5 components. Here we have these 5 components highlighted in the tree map. By inspecting what these components means, we notice that each one of these small clusters basically have one type of answer, and the central cluster is a mix. Also, the smaller clusters contain easy questions that were answered correctly, while the center has made much more mistakes. So we can hypothesize using these tools that in this case, we can correlate the embedding of the answer of the LLM with the confidence of the model and the level of question that were not used as a data to project. So to further explore the data, the user can reduce the simplification threshold to find fine-grained groups. So if the user reduces the simplification threshold to 30, 2 smaller components appear in the tree map. Notice that the layout is almost the same, with the tree map helping to identify this difference. The user can use the tree map to highlight only these 2 components to investigate what they mean. By inspecting the questions in each group, we notice that one group had straightforward questions focused on practical knowledge and basic science, like which weather instrument measures air pressure. And the second group covers a broad range of scientific topics with more detailed questions across multiple branches of science. So thus, by varying the simplification threshold and iteratively explore the projections through the tree map, one can analyze the data at multiple scales. So as conclusion, we propose a TopoMap++ that produces a more space-efficient layout, preserving topological relationships. Also, a topology-guided exploratory mechanism, and a more efficient computational process to enable large-scale real-world data analysis. So we'd like to thank the support of DARPA Capital One and NSF to make this work possible. And thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks, Philip. As the session, the stream will be end in 5 minutes, so we could be cut off at any time from now. So be prepared. Just one quick question. So I'm doing InfoVis primarily. So I wonder how can I apply this algorithm in some of my InfoVis tools, such as front-end tools, and can I add more interactivity based on your algorithm?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So I wonder, can I add more interactivity with based on your algorithm, such as checking the different points and manipulating some of the parameters and things like that?
Yeah, we can. We have also a small visualization tool that we can use, like the user can select in the tree map and automatically highlight the component, the component on the projection. So not only we can automatically you automatically suggest the user components to analyze, but the user can also click on the tree map and enlarge the components iteratively. So yes, add it iteratively to it is a possibility that it's enabled.
Great. Yeah, I think since we don't have much time left, and I would like to thank all the speakers and thank all the audience. And I think this is a great session and a lot of questions and interactions. I do suggest the audience and speaker linger around on Discord channel to discuss more. And I hope to see everyone next year in person. Okay, thank everyone.
Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.